wanted to end your presentation on was the ability of cBridge to identify toxic flow and let's say abusive traders and whatnot. And I actually wanted to start off our discussion talking about toxic flow because I think toxic flow is a very important topic that's top of mind for many brokers today. And I actually wanted to start off with Drew and ask him, in your many years of industry experience, how would you define toxic flow today among Forex and CFD brokers?
Sure. And I think that different brokers define it differently. But generally speaking, in general, it's flow you can't monetize, right? So for some brokers, it's, we use market reports. For some brokers, you can't monetize if the client is positive in 2 minutes. Some brokers, you can't monetize the client is positive in 15 minutes because they don't hedge, right? And so there's a lot, it means different things to different people, but generally speaking, it's what we can't monetize. And there's lots of different reasons, why we can't monetize, different customers. And it's a complex, situation, in terms of for different instruments. In certain instruments, the industry quotes tighter than real markets like gold and indices, especially in gold, where we're quoting fractions of real market, right? Which makes that conversation even more difficult, right? But I think that it means, for brokers that they have to set up different things depending on market conditions, and all of those things. But there is, as we get into it later, there's easy commonalities to combat toxic flow that most people don't invest in and don't do. And it's actually a lot of various, I would say there's no airtight solutions, but there is 90% of the solutions are fairly simple to get, and I think that would take care of about 90% of it. I think people, a lot of it is just sucking up the cost and the complexity of setting it up.
Mm-hmm. And John, what do you think in your many years of experience, handling toxic flow?
Sure. We have different ways of classifying toxic flow. So if you imagine, we've had this conversation quite recently because we've just launched a new feature, but there are two different types of toxic flow. There are those guys that are always profitable, and they're profitable because they're good traders. Fair enough, it's a minority, but they're good traders because they do good technical analysis or because they are following certain strategies. And then we classify true toxic flow as the guys that systemically abuse the system or the tech stack. Those would be the guys that do price arbitrage, the guys that beat decay analysis by front running, the guys that have technical advantages which go against the T's and C's of each broker. Those guys that actually do, everybody can catch internal arbitrage. So if you take one position on one account and you take another position on another account and you beat negative balance protection, easy to catch in your own broker. But external arbitrage, where I used to run capital and scaling, if I take a position on skilling in one direction and I take an identical position on ATFX in an opposite direction, that's external arbitrage. And there are we ran a quick analysis between a couple of our brokers. We saw 29,000 accounts in one day doing external arbitrage between two of our brokers. They were taking lot rebates for their IBs, they were taking credit abuse, they were taking negative balance protection. And so that's real toxic flow. And catching the technical toxic flow is a little bit more difficult than catching just those who are permanently profitable.
And Alexis, what's your perspective on these things? Again, I think you have a different view, sort of a view from the other side.
There's so many ways to define toxic flow because there's so many variations of it. Like the way I always like to describe it, it's finding a weakness or inefficiency it could be on the execution, on the LP side of the broker, or any side where to systematically, with this abuse, make profit of the broker, right? And I like to call it the unwelcome flow. And it also depends on who is on the other party. So maybe for broker A, this flow could be legit, would be fine, but for someone else, it could be toxic flow because it all depends on the risk model they're actually using, right? And it's also important to understand that there's two types of toxic flow. There's the retail toxic flow and the institutional. Toxic, as we know it, retail is, let's say, trading on inefficiencies of tech providers to get the stale price, or creating or flooding with limit orders to create this consistency. And then we have the institutional, which is more professional. They're using automations, they're using much better, let's say, infrastructure, and they have a much better market insight. So they're always one step ahead of the broker in regards to the price changes. So they're always one step ahead from the execution of the broker. Now, what has changed today is the gap that the brokers have to actually, I would say, take action. If we go back years before, they had, let's say, hours, days to make action. But today, with all this automated trading and all these, let's say, high volumes, even small windows in the day, if they open and they can have systematic abuse, it's an issue, right? And this is why the major thing is, I think you mentioned, you need to have the tools, you need to have the visibility to be able to see this toxic flow, identify it, and take an action.
I like how you termed it unwelcome flow and not necessarily toxic flow.
Because I think, Jonathan, you mentioned it, that there's many people that say, this flow is fine for me, and for others, it's not. So that's why I call it unwelcome. For some people, it can be welcome. For others, maybe not.
No, I completely agree with you. Even in my own layperson experience, I completely understand where you're coming from. And I think, John, you made a great point. There's different types of toxic flow in terms of there's just successful traders, and then there's the ones that were systematically trying to abuse you.